starting to understand the dimensions, the actual dimensions of personality properly, and to figure out what it means to be on one end of, say, openness and versus the other one. Especially if you're intelligent. You can be intelligent and not open. Those are complicated people. They've got very analytical minds. They make good lawyers. Like lawyers are often, and this is something you might think about if you're planning to become a lawyer, if you're high in openness, it's a bad job for you. You will not be happy. You need to be really conscientious, like off the scale. And it helps to be disagreeable too. So, because if you're too agreeable, well, you're supposed to win if you're a lawyer. You're not supposed to like nicely let the other person win, you know. You're supposed to fight to win. And so you have to be kind of fighty to do that. And if you're high in agreeableness, then it's a job that's kind of grates against your temperament. So anyway, what Jung was trying to do was to answer the question that Nietzsche posed at the end of the 19th century. And the reason Jung was trying to answer it was because he believed it was the most important question that had been posed at the end of the 19th century. And that was, you know, there's a famous quote by Nietzsche, right? I'm sure you've all heard it, and that's the quote that God is dead. So what Nietzsche said essentially was, God is dead and we have killed him. That's a different idea. And we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. And so it wasn't like a triumphal statement on Nietzsche's part, even though when you hear it quoted, you always hear it quoted that way. It's like it's a sort of victory, God is dead, you know, or something to celebrate. It's not what Nietzsche thought at all. In fact, he thought all hell was going to break loose because of it. And he predicted as much in the 1870s. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century with ridiculous accuracy, like it's uncanny. And that's partly because, you know, Nietzsche was one of these people like Jung who are very grounded in their deep, deep, deep imaginations. And so they get wind of the currents that are moving through society long before normal people do. So in some sense, you know, you can imagine that in any given population, even when you guys, there's some of you guys who are living like 50 years ago, and there's some of you living now, and there's some of you living 50 years in the future. It depends on how intelligent, imaginative versus how conservative you are. Because it's not like everyone develops at exactly the same historical rate. And you get people like Nietzsche, for example, or Dostoevsky, they're like 100 years ahead of everyone else. And so, you know, people don't even know what to do with them. But Stendhal was like that too, the writer. He wrote in the 1830s, and he was convinced that he was 100 years ahead of his time. And stylistically, that was probably about right. So, and the people who were prophets, regarded as prophets in say, Old Testament tradition, they were the same sort of people. It's like they had their ear to the ground in a sense, and they could tell what was going on underneath everybody's facade. It echoed in them, and often, as the stories go, and I'm sure they have a mythological accuracy to them, the people who were picking up the underground currents indicating often catastrophe felt absolutely compelled, even at the risk of their own skin, to warn people. So Jung was definitely one of these people. And now, this question, God is dead and we have killed him, led Nietzsche to pose another question, which was, well, what are we going to do to replace him? Because Nietzsche believed, and I think he was absolutely right about this, I can't see how it could be otherwise. He believed that the morality that had structured Western society was predicated on the fundamental axiom of divinity. And so, like as far as Nietzsche was concerned, the whole corpus of morality was dependent on that axiom being true, or at least being accepted as true. And when that axiom was knocked out by, say, the conflict between science and religion, because in some sense that's what did it, then the whole system no longer had anything to stand on and could become entirely questionable. And so Nietzsche pointed that out, and then Dostoevsky, who was writing basically at the same time, said, well, if there's no God, then anything is permitted. And what he meant by that was, really in some sense what he meant by that was, morality turns into what you can get away with. Because there's nothing final about it, there's nothing transcendent about it. And like, we've played this problem out intellectually. You guys are still right in the middle of this battle, whether you know it or not. I mean, so what happened in the 20th century was that one of the consequences of that loss of a fundamental underpinning led Europe to swing radically to political extremes. You know, the Nazis were, to think of the Nazis without thinking of that as a religious transformation is, like, that's just not right. It was a religious transformation, and it wasn't a good one. So, like, it was a regression in some sense to a morality that was way pre-Christian. Like, it was not good. And then, you know, you had the same, it was like the rise of the state as an alternative to God. Well, we saw what that produced. It produced hundreds of millions of painful deaths, and it just about destroyed the world. So it was a bad problem. And you know, we sort of skirted our way through that miraculously, you know. I don't really think World War II came to an end until 1989, you know, because there was the whole Cold War period after the Germans and the Japanese had surrendered. But I mean, we just went from one war to another. We just went to another one that everyone was too afraid to fight. It was still a war, you know, and that didn't end until 1989. And by some miracle, God only knows why, you know, it never degenerated into a thermonuclear exchange. And it was close, man. We just barely squeaked through that. There were 2 times during that period. One in 1964, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they had those bloody ICBMs primed. And so the way they worked was in the control panel, which kind of looked like a Star Trek, you know, the old Star Trek sets. There'd be like a panel here, and there was a little place you could put a key. Then about 20 feet over there, there'd be another guy with a key. And if he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds at the same time, he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds, then the missile launched. And an intercontinental ballistic missile is a bullet. And I mean that technically. It's not a guided missile. Once you launch it, like you shoot a bullet, it's gone. You don't get to tell the bullet to come back once it's gone. You can turn around like a cruise missile. An intercontinental ballistic missile, it goes where you aimed it, and you don't get to bring it back. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the locks. So we were 10 seconds away. Man, I tell you, that was a tight keyhole. We barely squeaked through that one. And it looks like by about 1989, that collective consciousness, or Jung would say the collective unconscious of the human race, had decided that, well, maybe having it all end in like apocalyptic annihilation wasn't necessarily for the best. It's interesting because writers like Goethe, he wrote Faust, and Faust is this tale of a man who makes a bet with the devil so that he can acquire infinite knowledge, essentially. And the devil in Faust is named Mephistopheles. And Goethe was trying to explain what human evil, or evil per se, what its motive was. And he did a lovely job. It's so smart what he said. He said, the devil's basic hypothesis, and of course Goethe expresses this in poetry, is that life is so unbearably cruel and random and tragic that it would be better if it had never existed at all. And you know, you believe me, there'll be times in your life where you think that, you know, where something has just knocks you off your feet in a completely unjust manner, you know. And that thought, it'll rise up, and like it's a compelling thought. And I think that's the thought that human beings were wrestling with. Well, we've been wrestling with it forever, but we didn't really vote on it till 1989. You know, and life barely won. And you know, life is a troublesome business. It's a tragedy. And you know, everyone asks himself now and then is if their consciousness is worth the pain. Well, the answer to that is it depends on how you live. That is the answer to that. But, you know, that's a complicated answer, and just because you know that answer doesn't mean that you know how to live.